Ipswich in late 2006 did not feel like a place where horror announced itself loudly. It arrived quietly, folded into the routines of winter. The town carried on with its narrow streets and early darkness, the river Orwell moving as it always had, the air damp and cold. What changed first were not the headlines, but the absences. Women who were usually seen on certain corners did not appear. Names circulated in murmurs, passed between outreach workers, other women on the streets, drug services, and police officers who knew the area well enough to notice when a familiar face failed to turn up for a night, then another. At first, each disappearance could still be explained away. The women lived precarious lives. They drifted between hostels, friend sofas, short stays in custody or hospital wards. Drug binges blurred time. Silence, in this world, was not always unusual. But as November edged into December, the explanations began to feel thin. This was not one woman losing contact. It was several. And they all belonged to the same invisible category: women selling sex to survive, women already written off by much of society long before they vanished. Gemma Adams was the first to be reported missing. 25 years old. She had been in Ipswich only briefly before she disappeared in mid-November. She had a family elsewhere, a life that had not always looked like this. But by the time she arrived in Suffolk, she was struggling, vulnerable, easy prey for anyone who chose to see her that way. When she failed to return calls, when days passed without word, concern grew quickly among those who knew her. Police began looking, still with the assumption that she might reappear. Less than 2 weeks later, Tanya Nicol vanished. She was 19. She had grown up in care, had already lived through more instability than most people twice her age. To the public, if they noticed her at all, she was just another young woman on the margins. To those who worked with her, she was fragile, impulsive, and frightened more often than she let on. Her disappearance was harder to dismiss. 2 women gone. Same area. Same background. A pattern began to form, faint but unmistakable. The third disappearance cut deeper. Anneli Alden was 24, a mother. She had 2 children living with relatives. She talked about them often. She wanted, one day, to be well enough to be part of their lives again. When she failed to collect a methadone prescription and stopped answering her phone, alarm spread quickly. Those who knew Anneli understood the difference between chaos and silence. This was silence of the wrong kind. Ipswich police were now faced with something they did not want to name yet. Officially, there were missing persons. Unofficially, among officers, outreach workers, and women still working the streets, the word killer began to surface. The fear was specific and intimate. The women knew how they were vulnerable. They knew what it meant to get into a stranger's car in winter, in the dark, when the need for money or drugs outweighed instinct. They also knew when someone was taking advantage of that vulnerability in a way that felt calculated. The town itself seemed slow to react. Ipswich was not London. It was not used to being watched. The disappearances did not immediately dominate national news. There was no dramatic crime scene yet, nothing for cameras to gather around. But tension crept in all the same. Families waited by phones. Police officers began working longer hours, checking CCTV, tracing last sightings, speaking to men who had been seen picking women up. Each new lead carried the weight of urgency, because everyone sensed that time mattered in a way it usually did not. On December 2nd, the case changed irrevocably. A passerby walking his dog near Belstead Brook, just outside Ipswich, noticed something among the trees. It was Gemma Adams. Her body lay in a shallow area near the water, exposed to the cold. There was no dramatic concealment, no attempt to bury her. It was as if she had been placed and left. The cause of death would later be confirmed as strangulation. The discovery landed with a blunt force. This was no longer about missing persons. It was murder, and it was almost certainly not isolated. The relief that often comes with finding a missing person alive was replaced by a heavier, more corrosive certainty. Someone had done this, and whoever it was had not been interrupted. Police moved quickly, sealing off the area, beginning forensic work, notifying Gemma's family. But even as they worked, another body was found. Later that same day, in a wooded area near Copdock, not far from where Gemma lay, officers discovered Tanya Nicol. She too had been strangled. She too had been left in the open. 2 bodies in one day erased any remaining hesitation. Ipswich was dealing with a serial killer. The word entered the public domain, bringing with it fear, anger, and an uncomfortable reckoning with who the victims were. News crews arrived. Headlines hardened. The town's name became linked, almost overnight, with violence. For the women still working the streets, fear turned practical. Some stopped altogether. Others paired up or refused to get into cars unless they knew the man. Outreach workers begged them to stay off the streets. But addiction does not pause for public safety warnings. Poverty does not wait for police briefings. Each night carried the same cruel calculation: risk death now, or risk withdrawal, hunger, homelessness. Within days, the ground gave up another body. A Nellie Alden was found on December 10th near Nacton, again in a rural location, again strangled. She had been missing for weeks. The timeline made clear that while police were still searching for first women, the killer had already moved on. The speed of the killing suggested confidence, or compulsion, or both. By now, Ipswich was gripped by a specific kind of dread. This was not random violence. The killer was choosing his victims carefully. He knew who would get into a car. He knew where to take them. He knew that it might take time before anyone noticed they were gone. And he knew, perhaps most chillingly, that society's indifference would buy him time. Public anger began to rise, not only at the killer, but at the conditions that had allowed this to happen. Questions were asked about why it took so long for concern to escalate, about how easily these women could vanish without immediate alarm. Families spoke to reporters, their grief raw and unpolished, reminding anyone who would listen that these were daughters, sisters, mothers. Not statistics, not cautionary tales. People. Police intensified their efforts, bringing in hundreds of officers, reviewing thousands of hours of CCTV, tracing vehicle movements, phone records, and financial transactions. Every man who had been seen picking up women in the red light area was now a potential suspect. Tension between urgency and precision defined every decision. Move too slowly and more women might die. Move too fast, and the wrong man might be accused while the real killer walked free. By mid-December, Ipswich was holding its breath. The streets were quieter. The river banks and wooded edges of the town felt suddenly sinister, as if the landscape itself had been complicit. And behind it all loomed a question that no one wanted answered, but everyone feared. How many more women would have to die before the man responsible was stopped? The discovery of a Nellie Alden's body did not bring clarity. It deepened the sense that events were accelerating beyond control. Police now faced a reality that the killings were not slowing in response to heightened patrols or public warnings. The rural edges of Ipswich woodlands, riverbanks, quiet lanes normally passed without thought, had become sites of dread. Each search risked becoming another recovery. Each phone call carried the possibility of confirmation rather than hope. On December 12th, less than 48 hours after Nellie was found, the pattern tightened further. Paula Clennell's body was discovered near a field in Levington. She was 24, from Liverpool, and had been reported missing only days earlier. Paula had been trying, again, to get clean. She spoke to family members frequently, oscillating between optimism and despair. Her death carried particular cruelty. It demonstrated that even rapid reporting and heightened awareness were not enough to interrupt the killer's momentum. Paula had been strangled, like the others. The consistency was now unmistakable. There was no frenzy at the scenes, no obvious attempt to mutilate or degrade. The violence was contained, purposeful, and lethal. Investigators noted that strangulation required proximity and control. This was not impulsive violence carried out in panic. It was deliberate, sustained, and intimate. Ipswich, by this point, was no longer simply afraid. It was angry. The anger was diffuse and often misdirected, aimed at police, at social services, at the sex trade itself. Some demanded harsher crackdowns on prostitution, as if visibility was a problem rather than vulnerability. Others argued that the women should have been protected long before a killer exploited their circumstances. The debate unfolded loudly in the media, but beneath it lay a simpler, uglier truth. These deaths forced the town to confront how easily certain lives could be ignored until they ended violently. For detectives, the challenge was narrowing a suspect pool that initially seemed impossibly wide. Hundreds of men had driven through the red light area in recent months. CCTV cameras captured vehicles entering and leaving, but winter darkness and grainy footage made identification difficult. License plates were traced, owners questioned, alibis checked. Most led nowhere. Some men were simply seeking sex. Others were looking to buy drugs. A few, it emerged, had histories of violence, but none yet connected all the dots. What investigators didn't know was that the killer was comfortable navigating the town and its outskirts. The disposal sites were not random. They suggested familiarity with rural roads and secluded locations, places unlikely to be disturbed quickly, but not so remote as to require careful navigation. The bodies were left in positions that did not suggest panic or haste. There was no attempt to hide them deeply, no covering with foliage or earth. This raised troubling questions about motivation. Was the killer indifferent to discovery, or did he want the bodies found? As forensic work progressed, small details gained weight. Fibers were collected, soil samples compared, phone records examined. In several cases, last known contact involved men offering lifts. Witnesses described a silver or gray car, seen repeatedly in the area. It was a slender lead, but in a case defined by repetition, slender leads mattered. On December 18th, the killings claimed their fifth victim, Annette Nichols, 29, was found near a stream in Hindlesham. She had been reported missing just days earlier. Like the others, she was known to drug services and outreach workers. Like the others, she had been trying, in fits and starts, to stabilize her life. Her death marked a grim milestone. 5 women in just over a month, all strangled, all discarded in the countryside around Ipswich. The cumulative effect was devastating. Police now openly acknowledged they were racing a killer who might not stop on his own. Officers worked around the clock, exhaustion setting in alongside pressure from senior officials and the national press. Every decision was scrutinized. Every missed opportunity, real or imagined, was dissected. Yet amid the noise, the core task remained brutally simple. Identify the man who had been picking women up, killing them, and returning to his ordinary life. Public cooperation intensified. Tips flooded in, many contradictory, some fueled by fear rather than evidence. Innocent men were named and discarded. The danger of tunnel vision loomed, but so did the danger of paralysis. Detectives balanced between the two, increasingly guided by forensic results rather than speculation. One breakthrough came quietly, almost mundanely. Fibers found on some of the victims' clothing were identified as consistent with fibers used in car upholstery and workwear. Separately, CCTV analysis began to focus on a specific vehicle seen repeatedly in the red light district around the times the women disappeared. It was not flashy. It did not stand out except through repetition. Repetition, again, became the key. On December 18th, as Annette Nichols' body was being processed, police arrested a man named Steve Wright. He was 48, lived locally, and worked as a forklift truck driver at the Port of Felixstowe. His car matched the description investigators had been refining. He had been seen in the area frequently. When questioned, inconsistencies emerged in his account of his movements. Wright did not resemble the monstrous figure many had imagined. He was quiet, unremarkable, a husband and father. Neighbors expressed shock, not because they knew him well, but because they did not know him at all. He blended into the background of working life. This ordinariness unsettled people more than overt menace might have. It suggested that the boundary between safety and danger was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. As Wright was taken into custody, Ipswich exhaled cautiously. Relief mingled with dread. An arrest did not yet mean justice. It did not undo the harm or restore the lives lost, but it did interrupt the pattern. No more women disappeared after December 18th. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with waiting. For the families of the victims, the arrest reopened wounds rather than closing them. They watched news coverage with a mixture of hope and fury, aware that a legal process now stood between them and any form of resolution. For the women who survived, who had worked the same streets and gotten into the same kinds of cars, the knowledge that the killer had been an ordinary man was chilling. It meant the danger had not announced itself. It had smiled, spoken, and driven away. The investigation now moved from the fields and riverbanks into interview rooms and forensic labs. The question was no longer whether there had been a serial killer, but whether the evidence would hold, whether the story that was forming could be proven beyond doubt. And beneath that unspoken but present was another question. How many warning signs had been missed before 5 women were reduced to evidence bags and case files? The arrest of Steve Wright did not bring immediate peace. It shifted the tension into a narrower, more intense space. Now the weight sat squarely on evidence. What could be proven? What could withstand scrutiny? What could speak for 5 women who no longer could? In interview rooms, Wright appeared calm, even mundane. He did not fit the public's hunger for spectacle. There were no dramatic outbursts, no confessions offered in a moment of theatrical collapse. Instead, there was denial measured and persistent. Police understood the risk. A case built on pattern and probability would not be enough. The scale of the crimes demanded something firmer. Wright was charged with murder, but charges were only the beginning. The investigation pivoted into its most exacting phase, one where every fiber, every trace of DNA, every minute of CCTV footage had to align into a narrative that could survive a courtroom. Forensic science became the quiet engine driving the case forward. DNA recovered from the victim's clothing and bodies was compared against Wright's. The results were decisive. His DNA was found on all 5 victims. It was not incidental. It could not be explained away by coincidence or secondary transfer. In a case that had begun with women disappearing into silence, the science spoke with clarity. Investigators reconstructed timelines with painstaking care. CCTV placed Wright's vehicle repeatedly in the red light district on the nights the women vanished. Mobile phone records trace his movements, mapping a life that intersected with the victim's final hours. Work records showed shifts that aligned with gaps in his whereabouts. Each element alone might have raised suspicion. Together, they formed a structure that was difficult to dismantle. Yet even as the evidence mounted, the emotional complexity of the case deepened. Wright was not a drifter or a man living on society's edges. He had a home, a job, routines. He returned from nights of killing to ordinary mornings. He ate meals when to work, spoke to colleagues. This duality forced a reckoning with assumptions about danger. The killer had not stood apart from the community. He had been embedded within it. The prosecution's task was to present this reality without sensationalism, to let facts carry their own weight. In court, the victims' lives were laid out not as footnotes to their deaths, but as human stories interrupted. Jurors heard about Gemma Adams' attempts to stabilize her life, about Tanya Nichols' youth and vulnerability, about Anneli Alderton's children, about Paula Clennell's efforts to get clean, about Annette Nichols' relationships and struggles. The cumulative effect was heavy, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The defense offered little in the way of alternative explanation. Wright maintained his innocence, but the narrative available to him was narrow. There was no credible suggestion of another perpetrator. No evidence pointed elsewhere. The consistency that had defined the killings now defined the prosecution's case. This was not a mystery seeking a solution. It was an account demanding acknowledgement. Outside the courtroom, Ipswich watched with a mixture of exhaustion and grim attention. The town had already lived through the worst of the fear. What remained was a slower, more reflective pain. Conversations shifted from who did this to how did this happen. Outreach workers spoke about years of underfunding. Families of sex workers spoke about stigma. Police acknowledged, carefully, that vulnerable women had not always been treated with the urgency they deserved. When the verdicts came, they were unanimous. Steve Wright was found guilty of all 5 murders. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a whole life order ensuring he would never be released. The legal language was severe, but it did not feel disproportionate. If anything, it felt insufficient to some, an abstract punishment measured against irreparable loss. For the families, the verdict offered a form of closure that was more procedural than emotional. There was relief and certainty, in the knowledge that the man responsible would not harm anyone else. But there was no restoration. Children would still grow up without mothers. Parents would still mark birthdays and holidays with absence. Justice, in this context, was not healing. It was containment. The aftermath exposed fractures that had existed long before the killings. Ipswich faced questions about how it viewed sex work, addiction, and poverty. Some changes followed: increased support for outreach programs, renewed attention to safeguarding vulnerable women, a brief period where empathy seemed louder than judgment. But memory fades, and urgency is difficult to sustain once headlines move on. What lingered most powerfully was the ordinariness of the crime's architecture. Wright had not relied on elaborate schemes. He exploited predictability, predictable desperation, predictable indifference, predictable routes through the town. The violence was stark, but not chaotic. It was built on the assumption that no one would notice quickly enough, that no one would prioritize these women until bodies appeared. In that sense, the Ipswich murders were not only about one man's actions. They were about the space created around him, a space where certain lives could vanish quietly, a space where danger could operate without immediate resistance. The investigation closed that space temporarily, forcefully. Whether it stayed closed was a broader question, one that extended beyond the courtroom and into the fabric of the community itself. When the trial ended and the cameras left, Ipswich was left with a quieter reckoning. The machinery of justice had done its work. A man had been named, tried, and removed from society. On paper, the case was complete. But completion did not feel like resolution. It felt more like an end to noise and an end to grief. In the months that followed, the town attempted to return to normality. Streets reopened, patrols eased. The red light district, altered by fear and scrutiny, slowly resumed its rhythms. Yet the landscape itself seemed changed. Wooded paths and riverbanks that had once been neutral now carried memory. Ordinary places had become markers of loss. People avoided them or passed through them with an awareness that did not fade easily. The families of the victims continued to live with an absence that no verdict could fill. They spoke occasionally to the press, less often as time went on, not because the pain diminished, but because repetition brought little comfort. They reminded anyone willing to listen that their daughters were more than the circumstances of their deaths. That addiction and sex work were chapters, not definitions. That love had existed long, before violence erased futures. For the women who survived, the impact was uneven but profound. Some left Ipswich entirely. Others remained bound by the same economic and personal constraints that had shaped their lives before the murders. Trust, already fragile, became more so. The memory of how easily danger had passed for normalcy lingered. Getting into a car was no longer just a transaction. It was a calculation haunted by faces that never came back. Police reviews examined the investigation in clinical terms. What worked? What did not? The speed of the arrest was cited as evidence of effective coordination. The reliance on forensic evidence was praised. But within those assessments were quieter acknowledgments that missing women from marginalized backgrounds had not always triggered the same level of alarm as others might have. That urgency had increased only once bodies were found. These acknowledgments did not come with easy solutions. Steve Wright himself retreated into obscurity. He did not grant interviews. He did not seek to explain. In prison, he became a name attached to a case rather than a person of interest. This silence frustrated some and relieved others. Without a narrative from him, there would be no distorted attempt at justification, no final insight into motive. What remained were actions and consequences, stark and unembellished. Criminologists and commentators debated his psychology. Some described him as driven by control, others by anger, others by long suppressed resentment. All agreed on one point: he did not kill in a vacuum. His crimes depended on access and opportunity. They depended on a world where certain women could be approached without witnesses, taken without immediate alarm, and missed only after time had passed. The Ipswich murders became a case study, taught in training rooms and lecture halls, not because they were especially complex, but because they were painfully clear. A pattern of vulnerability met a pattern of violence. A man with no outward markers of monstrosity exploited that intersection repeatedly until chance, evidence, and effort converged to stop him. The lessons were uncomfortable precisely because they did not rely on rare or exotic factors. Years on, the names of the victims are spoken less often in public. This is how time works, even with tragedy. But within certain circles, families, outreach workers, investigators of memory remains active. It surfaces in policy discussions, in training sessions, in the quiet decisions made when another woman fails to show up and someone chooses to escalate concern rather than wait. The Ipswich case does not offer a redemptive ending. There is no moment where balance is restored or meaning neatly extracted from suffering. What it offers instead is clarity. 5 women were killed because they were accessible, because they were underestimated, because the risk to them was normalized. They were killed by a man who relied on that normalization, who moved to the town unseen until his actions forced visibility. To remember the case honestly is to resist the temptation to turn it into spectacle. It is to sit with the discomfort of recognizing how much of the violence was enabled by indifference. It is to acknowledge that fear arrived only when bodies appeared, not when women disappeared. And it is to understand that prevention, if it is to mean anything, must begin earlier in moments that do not yet feel like emergencies. Ipswich carries this history quietly now. It does not define the town, but it marks it, like the river that runs past its edges. The memory remains, moving beneath the surface, shaping the ground over time. The murders are over. The questions they raised are not. They persist, waiting to be answered not by outrage alone, but by sustained attention to those most easily ignored.